Welcome to Libyth. On the surface, Oku no Hosomichi is a travel diary. A man walks from Edo to the deep north of Japan and writes about what he sees. The structure is provided by geography. Here is a river, here is a mountain pass, here is a famous bay, here is a ruined palace. The facts of the journey are real. Basho actually walked this road, actually visited these places, actually arrived at each location in the sequence the text presents. If you wanted to, you could use the text as a kind of rough guide, and people have done exactly this, retracing Basho's route with the text in hand, finding the places he describes, standing where he stood. On that level, the text is transparent, a window onto a journey that happened in a Japan that no longer exists, but that left enough of itself behind in its landscapes to be partially recognizable. But a window is always also a thing in itself. It has a frame that determines what you can see. It has a thickness that affects the quality of the light. It has a surface that may or may not be clean, that may reflect as much as it transmits. And the question of what Oku no Hosomichi is doing beneath its surface, what it is that makes this particular window worth looking through for more than 3 centuries, is the question that makes the text inexhaustible. Because the journey is also a death, a spiritual ordeal, a philosophical argument, an act of mourning, and a practice of attention so demanding that most people can only sustain it for moments at a time, which is precisely why the haiku form, maximum 17 syllables, is the instrument best suited to it. Bashō writes farewell poems before departing. This is a cultural convention for dangerous journeys, a form of preparation for the possibility of not returning, and Bashō uses it sincerely because the journey is genuinely dangerous and genuinely uncertain. But in the context of the text he is beginning to write, the farewell poems do something more than manage practical uncertainty. They mark a death, not a literal one, not the death of the body, but the death of the self that has accumulated in Edo over decades of teaching and reputation and social obligation. The Bashō who leaves is leaving that self behind along with the city. What walks north is not yet the new self that the journey will produce, but the gap between the old and the new, the threshold state, the condition of the traveler who has let go of one shore and not yet reached the other. This is the deepest figurative structure of the text, and it runs beneath every episode, every landscape, every haiku. The journey as spiritual death and rebirth, as the dissolution of the ego in the acid of impermanence, as the practice of releasing attachment to everything, place, people, reputation, even the self that does the releasing, until what remains is not nothing but something cleaner and lighter and more fully present to the world. This is not an obscure mystical claim. It is a very precise description of what happens to consciousness when it is sustained in movement through unfamiliar landscapes for 5 months, cut off from its usual sources of reinforcement, exposed to weather and difficulty, and the specific quality of attention that wilderness demands. The Buddhist layer of this reading is the most explicit in the text, and it is the one Bashō would have expected his educated readers to recognize immediately. The teaching at the heart of Mahayana Buddhism, the form that had shaped Japanese religious life for centuries, is that dukkha, suffering, arises from tanha, craving, and that craving arises from the illusion of a permanent self that needs to be satisfied and protected. The self is not a thing. It is a process, a pattern of arising and passing, and the suffering generated by treating this pattern as a permanent entity in need of protection is the fundamental problem of human existence. The path toward liberation is not the acquisition of more things that might satisfy the craving self, but the gradual, patient, difficult dissolution of the craving self itself. The recognition that what you have been protecting was never quite what you thought it was. Travel, particularly the kind of solitary travel through remote landscapes that Basho was practicing, has been understood within Buddhist frameworks as a form of this practice for as long as Buddhism has existed in Japan. When you leave the city, you leave the infrastructure that supports the illusion of a permanent self, the familiar routines, the relationships that confirm your identity, the possessions that mark your position, the role you play in the lives of others. On the road, stripped of these supports, the self is exposed to the fact of its own contingency. It is hungry or cold or lost or ill. It is dependent on the kindness of strangers. It cannot insist on its usual comforts and certainties. And in this exposure, if the conditions are right and the attentiveness is sustained, something becomes available that the defended and comfortable self cannot access. The world as it actually is, rather than as the self needs it to be. The Taoist layer, which runs alongside the Buddhist one without being identical to it, adds a different dimension. Taoism is less concerned with the illusion of the self than with the wisdom of yielding, the discovery that the most powerful form of engagement with the world is not force but receptivity, not imposition but attentiveness, not the assertion of what one wants, but the discernment of what is. The Taoist sage does not push. The sage finds the grain of things and moves with it, the way water finds the lowest point without effort, the way a blade cuts most cleanly along rather than across the fiber. Wu Wei non-action, or the action of non-forcing, is the formal concept, but the practice it describes is simpler than the concept. Stop trying to make things be other than they are, and see what they actually are. Basho on the road is practicing Wu Wei. He moves when it is time to move. He rests when weather or illness prevents movement. He writes when the haiku arrives, and does not write when it doesn't. The text is the residue of this receptivity. These two layers meet most powerfully at Hiraizumi. The literal fact at Hiraizumi is simple. Here is a field where buildings used to be. Here is grass growing where halls once stood. Here is the absence of a civilization that once flourished. The literal fact can be established by historical research, confirmed by archaeology, discussed in guidebooks. The ambition to build something permanent, the belief that art and architecture and military power together could produce something that would last, the determination to exist rather than simply to pass. The haiku, summer grasses, all that remains of warriors' dreams, translates this weight into an image that is smaller than the prose and larger than the prose simultaneously. Smaller because 17 syllables, a field, some grass. Larger because the image contains the entire argument about human ambition and the patience of the world, and it contains it in a form that requires no elaboration and no argument, that lands directly in feeling rather than passing through understanding. The Du-Fu connection at this moment is not ornamental. It is structural, and it transforms the local episode into something with universal reach. Du-Fu wrote from inside the collapse of the Tang dynasty, from inside the burning of the capital, the destruction of the court, the end of the civilization he had served and loved. What he found in that position was not simply grief, though there is grief in his poetry, but a mode of witness that refused to look away from the full cost of human ambition and political violence, while also refusing to pretend that the beauty being destroyed was not beautiful. He held both simultaneously. The flowers continuing to bloom in the burned palace, the birds continuing to sing in the ruined courtyards, the spring continuing to arrive indifferently in a city that was coming apart. Bashō inherited this mode, the mode of simultaneous grief and beauty, of looking at loss without the comfort of either denial or resolution, and carried it into the landscape of northern Japan. When he quotes Du Fu at Hiraizumi, he is placing the Fujiwara's destruction in a lineage of destructions that runs through Chinese history as well as Japanese, insisting that what happened here is not simply a Japanese story, but a human one, that the grass that covers these ruins is the same grass that covers every ambition that ever believed itself permanent. The road itself is the text's central metaphor, and it is a metaphor that earns its meaning through the literal reality of what walking 2,400 kilometers actually involves. A metaphor is only as good as its vehicle, and the vehicle here is very good. The road has physical properties that make it a precise instrument for the ideas the text is exploring. It is linear. You cannot walk backwards on a road without also walking forward, without moving through new space, even as you move through remembered space. You can return to a place, but you cannot return to the moment of first arriving at it, the moment when the place was new, and your eyes met it without the film of familiarity. The road is irreversible in this sense, not in the sense that you cannot turn around, but in the sense that each moment of the journey is singular, unrepeatable, gone as soon as it has happened. To travel the road is to accept this irreversibility, to commit to the moving forward without the safety net of return. And this commitment is the formal equivalent of the Buddhist teaching on impermanence. Every moment is this moment and no other, and the attempt to hold it is the attempt to stop time, which is the attempt to stop life. The journey is home, Bashō says, and this sentence carries more weight than any single statement should be asked to carry. One layer of its meaning is the literal observation that the traveler who is always on the road has, in a sense, made the road their home, has adapted to impermanence as a condition of existence rather than a deviation from it. Another layer is the claim that the mode of attention that travel requires, alert, present, stripped of habituation, genuinely seeing rather than simply confirming what one expects to see, is the mode of attention that makes life most fully livable, that turns mere existence into something that deserves the name of experience. A third layer is the suggestion that the destination is not elsewhere, that you are already there, that the journey is not instrumental to some separate goal, but is itself the goal, itself the home, itself the thing you were looking for when you started walking. The questions the text refuses to answer are as significant as the ones it addresses. Is Bashō free on this journey, or is he fleeing? The wandering poet is a recognized social role with established conventions, and inhabiting a role, however liberating the role might seem, is not the same as escaping the social order. Bashō left a school and a set of obligations, but he carried with him a reputation that opened doors and generated obligations of a different kind. The obligation to be Bashō everywhere he went, to produce poems of sufficient quality to justify the hospitality, to perform the role of the wandering poet sage with the consistency that the role demanded. The freedom of the road is real, but it is not absolute, and the text knows this even if it does not dwell on it. Is the beauty Bashō encounters and preserves in haiku a form of consolation for the losses that the journey requires? The loss of comfort, the loss of the companion, the loss of the self that existed before the road? Or is it a form of evasion, The capacity of haiku to convert any experience into beauty is immense, and one could argue that this capacity is not always a virtue, that it aestheticizes what might instead be confronted directly, that the 17-syllable form is a machine for making everything bearable that perhaps should not always be made bearable. Basho is too honest a thinker to answer this question in his own favor, but he is also too committed to the practice to abandon it, and the tension between these two positions, between the beauty the form produces and the question of what the form might be doing to the experience it transforms, is one of the most productive unresolved tensions in the text. Mono no aware, the pathos of things, the poignancy of beauty in full awareness of its transience, is the aesthetic concept that Matori Norinaga would later use to describe the central quality of Japanese literature. And it names something that Oku no Hosomichi produces more purely and more consistently than almost any other text. But it also names something that is philosophically complex, something that is not simply the emotion of being moved by beauty, but the specific emotion of being moved by beauty while knowing it is passing. This is a state of double consciousness, awareness of the beautiful and awareness of the beauty's impermanence at the same moment. And it is a state that most people cannot sustain for long, because it requires simultaneously opening to experience and holding the knowledge of loss. Haiku, in its brevity, enforces this double consciousness by making the holding brief. 17 syllables, and it is over. The brevity is not a limitation. It is the form discovering that the double consciousness it requires can only be sustained for 17 syllables at a time, and building itself to fit that discovery. Wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of imperfect and incomplete beauty, the beauty of the worn and weathered and unfinished, operates in the same territory as Mono no aware, but arrives at it from a different direction. Where Mono no aware is primarily about time, about beauty experienced in the awareness of its passing, Wabi-sabi is primarily about form, about the beauty that is revealed rather than constructed, that requires decay or incompleteness or irregularity to become fully itself. The cracked ceramic bowl is more beautiful than the perfect one, not despite its damage, but because the damage is the record of its existence in time, the trace of what it has encountered and survived. The mountain temple, weathered to the color of the stone it sits on, is more beautiful than a new building, not despite its age, but because the age is the form that time has found for it, the shape it has become through decades of encounter with weather and use, and the slow work of moss and lichen. Basho's haiku are wabi-sabi objects in this sense. They reach toward something that is just beyond the edge of what language can hold. They leave a space unfilled that no additional word could fill. They make the incompleteness itself the point of arrival, rather than a failure to arrive. Every haiku ends in a silence that is also a fullness, a gap that is also a presence. Zen aesthetics, the third philosophical lineage shaping the text's figurative dimension, adds yet another layer. The Zen influence on Basho's poetics is the most discussed aspect of his work in the critical literature, and there is a risk of overstating it, of turning the poems into puzzles designed to produce satori and losing the concrete, physical, particular quality of the perceptions they record. But the Zen training in non-conceptual perception, in the attempt to meet a thing directly, without the filter of concept and category and expectation, to see the stone as stone rather than as an instance of the category stone, to hear the cicada as cicada rather than as a symbol of something else, is clearly operative in how Basho approaches the natural world. The cicadas at Yamadera are not symbols of summer or impermanence or the Buddhist teaching on suffering. They are cicadas, doing what cicadas do, and the poem records the quality of meeting them on those terms. The figurative dimension of the text arises not because Bashō is imposing meaning onto experience, but because the experience, met directly and without imposing, generates meaning of its own. What Oku no Hosomichi is ultimately doing, beneath all the layers of literal and figurative, journey and meditation, Buddhism and Taoism and Shinto, and the aesthetic traditions that the text both inherits and transforms, is making a case for a particular way of inhabiting a world that will not stop changing. The case is not made through argument. It is made through demonstration, through the sustained practice of attentiveness that the text embodies and invites the reader to participate in. To read this text well is to practice the thing it is about. To slow down, to hold the prose and the haiku simultaneously, to inhabit the gap between them without rushing to close it, to allow the moment to be what it is before asking what it means. This is the practice, and the practice is the answer to the question the text is asking. The question is not rhetorical. It is the central question of any life. How do you be in a world like this? How do you love what is passing? How do you pay attention to what is beautiful and let it go? Bashō's answer is, one haiku at a time, one step at a time, one day at a time on a road that is also, if you can learn to experience it that way, already home. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.